Thank you very much for joining us this late in the day after a long 2 days. I hope we value your time, and I hope you guys can walk away with a lot of good information. With that said, we do have a tremendous amount of information to look at. We're going to do, specifically Mohan is going to do a deep dive into only several areas, and the rest of it is pretty much a survey. I am Isaac Kunkel. I'm with Chainyard. Chainyard's an IT people company, and we are based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Mohan Venkatamaran, who's our CTO. A little bit about our topic today. We're going to be talking about different reference architectures. We're going to be talking about technical and business patterns, as well as an area that we're going to touch on is consortium building and governance. We've seen all of these things coming together in projects that we've been working on over the last 3 years, and so this is pretty much a survey of what we've learned, what we've done, and what we've coalesced into these slides today. A little bit about Chainyard. As I said, we're based in North Carolina. We're about 50 people now, 80% in North Carolina, 20% in Hyderabad, India. We have deep expertise in blockchain. Specifically, we've been working with Fabric since its inception. We were fortunate enough to partner with IBM in the early days of the beginning of the Hyperledger project, and we came into the labs with them to help them to start building their CI/CD pipeline to put out the quarterly releases. Obviously, it took a while to get to quarterly releases. That started last year. Happy to say that 1.4 was released today. We do focus on permission blockchains. We often get asked about crypto ideas. We tend to give people our opinions and thoughts on that, but the projects we've done over the last 3 years have all been based on permissioned blockchains. We specifically focus on the value that we believe blockchain will bring to enterprises as we continue to move forward. All right, we have done some work in Ethereum as well. Much of that has been in the government sector, and we've studied Quorum and Corda alongside those. We think all of those will tend to dominate going forward, and that's why we've put some effort into all of those. We've worked on a variety of platforms and industries, but the ones that we focus on and invest in are supply chains. You've seen an awful lot of those use cases over the last 2 days. In manufacturing and transportation specifically is where we've focused. We are Hyperledger members and active contributors. We also are members of VITA, which is Blockchain in Transport Alliance, which has over 400 members. So in the transportation industry, we're seeing a lot of traction as well and interest in blockchain. And we understand that much of that's because of the tremendous potential on the supply chains. And we have expertise in consortium building and setting up governance, and you'll see some of that in the reference architectures today. And the reason we can say we have expertise in that is we've worked on 3 projects that have moved to product status. They're all in their early stages of beta, but a lot of the work that we've done over the last 2 years has been working on building those consortiums, talking to people, inviting them in, finding the value for all the stakeholders, and then putting governance models in place. I'm happy to say that within the next quarter, you'll hear a product that we're launching in the supply chain space called Trust Your Supplier. And the last year has been a tremendous amount of nothing but the governance side, the consortium building side. The original prototype was done over a year ago. So as I noted, we have a lot to go through. Mohan's going to go through most of it. At the end, I will come back to the business patterns. I do want to say these slides should be available for download. If they're not, we're happy to share them with you, and you can ask questions at the end. We hope to have a few minutes for that, or you can see us afterwards.
Thank you. So this is the button. Which is, I just press this, right side? That's right. This one? Okay. Okay, I got it. So, good evening, everyone. I'm really very happy to be here to see such a big crowd. It is a little bit intimidating for me, but let's see how I can do a good job here. So what we have done is, like project after project, we learned the hard way. As Isaac said, I have 14 consultants in IBM Blockchain Labs. All they do is test the fabric before it goes into the community. And along with that, we learned a lot of stuff. Like the first project, we started without a participant in the network for a customer, and it turned out to be very difficult for us to take it to production because new members would refuse to join because they thought the first member, it's all very proprietary to the first member. So we learned that. In the next project, we learned that we have to have at least 2 members in the consortium before the project really can take off successfully. And that's a pattern we continued. And as Isaac says, like a lot of this is based on our learnings. We can quickly put together solutions for our customers. And I'm sharing our knowledge with you all. And I hope it is beneficial. The methodology or the approach that we follow may apply to you. It may not apply to you as well, or it may be a modified approach that suits you. So one of the first things that we said when we set out to build solutions, and whatever we build today, is we applied a set of core principles. We said, like, we will build only on Fabric, so that's our chosen platform. If not, if the customer's choice is Ethereum, we will do that. The second is we do want to utilize identity and access management. It is easy to read. I'm just going to skim through this, but we set up a set of core principles into any application that we are going to design in, whether it's Ethereum or whether it is Fabric. So we laid this out, but most of the experience from Ethereum has been distilled into the Fabric space. So if I move on to the next one, I have 45 slides, so I'm going to see how I can pace it nicely. So the first thing is, what we did is, whatever we learned, we learned that in order to enable a customer, we have to follow a very orderly pattern of analyzing the business case, of identifying the opportunity, and then from that point onwards, how do I take that opportunity to a strategy and an implementation? So we started with a blockchain reference model, and so it helped us a lot. And then we figured that when our product is going into production, the consortium became the biggest issue, meaning the contractual agreements with the legal lawyers on both sides, and then finer details of what we should do and what we should not do, who owns the code. So we went into governance, and we said, these are the steps we need to do in order to establish governance. But then, when we were doing governance, one of the parties said, have you done code scanning, security scanning? How are we sure that the network that you have built is actually secure? So we said, okay, let's hire an outside company to do a security analysis of our solution. And there came a security deployment model. And then from that point onwards, it's not blockchain alone. There are many participants in this network, whether it is SAP, Ariba, they're all part of the ecosystem of a solution. So we need to know end-to-end system architecture. And when we got all this together, I had to train our analysts what they do. So we said this is an analysis reference model that the analysts can go and work with our customers. So let's move on to the very first one. This is the simplest representation of our reference model. It looks at the business, the user, the blockchain, and the application and other services that need to be in the ecosystem. And what it helped us is it provides us a logical path to decompose the entire customer issue into very easy to understand what pieces do we need to actually analyze and develop and code. So we understood Fabric very well, and then we learned that you have to have organizations should have peers. So we laid this is a very high-level piece, and the next slide is going to be a little intense. Let's see what it says. Okay. So this is our reference model. Okay. When we go to a customer, okay, what you can see is on the top, you see that we have to do the business analysis thoroughly. You have to have a business model. We learned that you can't go with a technology and then later on try to figure the business model. We made that mistake in one of the projects, and then later on trying to justify what the business model is. So you have to work through the business model, the current and target process, the business transformation, where you are versus where you want to go along with your ecosystem business participants. You have to work through, and then you have to develop the business case, because one of the problems we have seen is if we don't define the business case very clearly, there is a tendency to do what we build today into a blockchain solution, and it becomes like a transactional system like anything else that we have screwed up in the past. So we have to know what the opportunity is, and from there, the business architecture, and then take on how do I design and deliver this, right? So that's very first in our model. Our business analysts work through a design thinking process with the customer, with all the stakeholders, and then we lay this out. Once it is done, the next step in us is to find who the users of the system are. Now, there's a composer model which says you need to know the participants, but what we noticed is there are business participants, which are organizations. For example, in some of Cisco, MetLife, Chevron, they're all members of a particular network we potentially will build. But then we have to understand who those participants are, and then whether they want to really be part of the network as a node operating user or an external. So we have to understand who the participants are. We then focus on technical participants. So in some of the solutions that we build, a node operator need not necessarily be an organization. What we noticed is that we could have a technical node which can do things like management or analytics or anything else, even key management. So because those are not owned by any specific organization, but they're part of the network. So the solution, as we expanded and we talked to many architects, we found that there are peers. Some of the organizations and their peers are business participants, and some of them are technical participants in the same network. And then we looked at other users. There are system and human users. So there are users who are systems, there are human users, and then there are passive users or external. Like in the solution we build, there could be an auditor who has nothing to do with the blockchain but is an advisor and sometimes uses the application, and so they need credentials. So are there active users versus passive users? Who are they? Internal and external human. Then governance members. So there could be governance members in the network we build. They have nothing to do with the blockchain, but they may be investors, they may have voting powers. So are there other members who need credentials on the network? Then go on into roles and responsibilities for each one and what is their access control mechanisms. And the next one, I'm dwelling a little bit longer on this, but then the rest of it, I will move a little faster. But on the blockchain side, we have to look at all the assets that we do, the model technically, what transactions are we dealing with, what kind of events the system has to generate. Then information management, like what is the information model, what is the data that I'm going to store on the chain, what is the data that I'm going to store off-chain, what is the data that has to be private, et cetera, like what is confidential, so that whole analysis. Then we look at all the contracts that we need to build, the contract templates. So we learned that in Ethereum, I could have contract templates and I could dynamically fire a contract at runtime. So we said, let's see how to do that. So in our reference model, we have contract templates, and we use that. Then business rules. You have to know all the business rules that need to be implemented on the contract or off contract. And then you go down, what are the policies? Policies are universally applicable, like passwords have to be changed every so often, or credentials have to be changed every so often. So what policies are there in the network? Look at audit and compliance. So many of the projects we have done, they involve audit and compliance. Show me your transaction history. Show me what kind of audits have you implemented. Can you prove to me so and so? So are there any audit and compliance requirements? Then look at oracles and integration. So there are solutions in which we actually communicate with external oracles, which might be things like exchange rates, or that could be integrations like SAP, Ariba, Salesforce, some of which we have done. So what kind of integrations are required? So an enterprise solution is not just a blockchain, self-contained. You have to talk to a bigger ecosystem. Then tokenization. In one of the solutions we are doing, actually, it's a Hyperledger project, but we learned how tokenization works with ERC20 and so on and so forth. So in the solution to, TYS, Trust Your Supplier, we actually issue credits of, credits in the form of ERC20 tokens that we implemented on top of Hyperledger so that we can issue credits to verifiers and others. And so we learned that tokenization has to be analyzed properly. What kind of tokens are they? Are they asset tokens, utility tokens, crypto tokens? And then last but not the least, documents. What documents do I need to save as part of my architecture? If there is an invoice, do I need a copy of the invoice stored externally, a hash of that document, physical document on the chain? So this is like a complete analysis of what all I need to do in order to build a full solution. And finally, UIs, in every application, everybody loves our UI. They don't know what is happening behind the scene. And so we increasingly noted that UI, UX expertise is essential for all the apps that we have developed. So there is a presentation layer, and then there is mobile UI, and then there is the application components, because an application talks to the blockchain, but it also talks to other pieces. So if you take this is the core of our reference. In order to build anything, we need to do this level of analysis. At the bottom, you can see a lot of other pieces, like, what is the pieces in the blockchain that I need to have? Then there is, what kind of API services and integrations I have to provide. These are platform services. Like if I do AWS, we are licensing AWS services like key management and so on and so forth. So what are the things on the platform that I really need to license? Some of it is self-explanatory, but we spend a lot of time looking at what HSM technologies are available, because the customer is very cost conscious. So we did a lot of evaluations. So we realized that in our platform, we need to consider what kind of HSM and key management services that we need to utilize. You can move on to the other areas. You can see what is my off-chain storage technology going to be, what is my document storage technology going to be, what is my application and analytics engine, because the solution we develop has got an integration into an analytics engine. So whether we use Watson or whether I use TensorFlow, what does the customer prefer? And then on the right block, in the complete side, we actually built reusable components, because every project I have login, I have session management, I have crypto encryption, decryption. So this whole set, we built pre-built components so that when I go to a customer, some of these things I don't have to keep reinventing. So we focus on the business aspects, and then we use our pre-built components, and then we figure out platform services, what do we need? And then at the bottommost layer is some of our solutions are implemented on IBP, some of them are on Azure, and some of them are on AWS. So we look at the platform services based on the customer. So this is like kind of our starting reference model for blockchain solutions, and that's what we use when we go to a customer. On the right side, you can see other things like, what kind of tools we will use, what is our development environment going to be, what kind of system management tools, so on and so forth. So with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift to the next one, which is like, we learned that we had to build a consortium. And we started off early trying to figure out what does consortium building mean. And we realized that when our first product is going out, we got to work with a variety of lawyers. And everything is like a homeowners association. If you live in the United States, my neighborhood has a homeowners association. There are bylaws, there are rules, and I have to behave according to the rules that the homeowners association has put together. They treat all of us as consortium members, right? So we used the same principles, and we noted that first thing in building consortiums is you have to have your bylaws or articles of engagement between all your participants. So there are investors who want to invest in your solution, and then there are consortium members who actually want to be a member of your consortium. So at the top, we have like governance processes, governance structure, financial model, and incentive model is the high-level components. At the bottom, we have technical components. So right now, we are negotiating what is the service level agreements, what is your disaster recovery, how are you going to support me if there is a bug, what is your ticketing system. These are the issues that are common in traditional applications. We are facing that with our own product and even with the solutions that we have supported. So we came up with, let's see, what are the different pieces that we need to do, right? So we looked at it. So governance process, I need to have workflow. So suppose a new member wants to join the consortium, and the existing members have a process, right? Fill up this form. You get, we have to verify the credentials of the new member who wants to join the consortium, be it an organization. We then have to issue them credentials. We have to issue them, how do we enroll them? How do we activate them on the network, so on and so forth. So there's this whole membership model. Then there's governance structure, who are the members of the network, what are their voting powers, which members, what are their roles and responsibilities on this governance team, what are their voting authorities, what are the segregation of duties. So our lawyer was asking us all the questions, actually, when we were sitting with them a couple of weeks ago. Is like, the guy who developed the code, does he have access to GitHub? Does the person who have access to GitHub, so most of the thread, he was questioning us on all kinds of things, and so we looked at segregation of duties. Then financial model. There's so many POCs built, but there is no financial model. Who is going to pay for the network? How is the revenue that you collect on the network going to be distributed? How are you going to collect the revenues? What kind of tokens are you going to issue? So we went through the process and listed that this is something essential when we look at governance. And then on the right side, you see technical operations management. How do I ensure SLA? So the SLA that one of the consortium members who wants to join our network said, I want 99.999, 3 nines, right? So we then, so in order to meet that SLA, we have to figure out whether we have the right number of nodes, whether if one node goes down, will the other node be affected? What is the transaction throughput to guarantee, on an average, 99.999% quality of service? So configuration management, issue management, disaster recovery, account management, service management, these are all like standard items on operations management. Then standards and guidelines, like when somebody wants to put a new contract into the network, then are there any standards and guidelines that they need to follow? What are the infrastructure policies? Suppose I want to bring my own node into the network and I want to bring my own server. Is there any guidelines in terms of what should be its sizing, what should be the memory, what should, stuff like what should be installed on it, what should not be installed. So those are all considerations on standards and guidelines. Then we look at audit and controls. What kind of audits are there? Like there are audits for SOX compliance, there is audits for regular HIPAA compliance, so what are the other things? And do we have any tools that can detect malicious behavior or non-compliance? And finally, change management. It's very essential because in the initial stages, we are releasing 1.1, 1.11, 1.12 into the environment because there's a lot of change as testers come in and they're testing our solution. So how do you manage all these changes? So we have governance contracts. In some of the solutions we built contracts that are not directly impacting the solution, but they are governance contracts. They are smart contracts that sit in front of the application contracts, run on the blockchain, and ensure that governance aspects are happening. And then smart contracts itself. So how do you manage the smart contracts and as well as your regular contracts? Who has to sign off on it? Have all the parties agreed to it? Can I deploy it now? So those are the other aspects. Okay, so this is like we noticed that big model cannot be done on one day. So when we worked with one of the projects, we had to time it. So what do I do? This is very important in the solutions you build. It is a case by case. In some solutions, you may do all of it. Some of it is very important and some of it is not. So what do we build in the first 3 months? And what do we do, what do we do before? Before we go into production, we should have the articles of engagement. And we should have the network operations and other things taken care of. Like what is your support model, and what is your operations team going to look like? What is your operations procedures? Those are all before you go into production. But once you go into production, what would you do in the first 3 months? What should you have in place in the next 6 months? And what should you have in the 12 to 24-month period? So this is what it lays out. Skipping to the next one, I'm going to skip this a little bit, but what I'm going to say is when we looked at security, our lawyers and the security audit company started to question us, like who are the officers in your company? What kind of authority they have? Are they all have they all signed NDA documents with the company? Have you had an NDA with the network participants? So they started to question us in all different directions. So we said, let us look at everything that needs to be really looked at in terms of security. So you have to have, insider threat is the biggest threat in the network. And so, we have to, when your lawyer works with you or when you're working with your consortium members, you got to look at who are your key threats. It's mainly insider threats. A guy who knows the smart contracts very well is the biggest threat. So you have to have things in place. Look at whether your user security is in place. How are you managing your keys? Do your keys leave out? So I did some of the work for the US federal government, and so they have NIST standards. And then when I was talking with the NIST consultant, he was saying, do your keys ever leave? How long are they in memory? So because he's measuring the window of time when the keys can be in memory and can somebody steal it. So he's asking me questions like, how are you securing it so that there is no man-in-the-middle attacks? So we said, like, let us look at how are we securing the keys? Are the keys ever leaving a container and coming out, or are we sending the encryption and decryption functions into the, into the key management service? Tokens, how are you securing your tokens? How are you securing your databases, off-chain, on-chain? So that was a big question, like, where is your data stored? If you do GDPR, and there are certain rules that I learned is like certain countries want the data to be in the nodes that are in their country-specific data center. So that you would face, and then how are you securing them? So that was, off-chain data, especially your configuration files. If you look at Fabric, or even if you look at Ethereum networks, there are so many configuration files, and there are other files that you need to secure. Then, how are you securing your application? Because that is user-facing. What kind of controls have you put in place? And finally, how are you securing your smart contracts? Are they exposed? Who all have authorization? Which ports are they running on? Are the endpoints visible? So those are kind of things that we had to go through. And finally, if you had to put your entire solution together, you had to look at the big picture, right? So blockchain is only one end of the spectrum, but my clients would like to connect to the blockchain using their own clients that they want to design, or they would like to use clients that we specifically give them. So, if I work with large customers, they want the API layer so that they can integrate it into their portals. If I work with small customers, they want a UI that we have customized and given it to them. So you got to look at how are you exposing your APIs, and in which languages are they available, and then what is the UI UX technology going to be, and messaging. So a lot of our solutions use microservices. Like if I'm exposing SAP services, I'm using microservices as a way of exposing functions to the blockchain network or to our application. And finally, on the extreme left is like, how am I connecting to SAP in a secure manner? How am I connecting to Ariba? How am I connecting to Salesforce? How am I connecting to anything else that's an enterprise app? So that kind of like tells us, what we really build our solutions on. And this little piece tells us like, this is our blockchain reference architecture for doing analysis. We already covered this before. And this is a piece of the reference architecture that our business analysts go, and we have detailed decks on what we actually ask questions when our analysts work with the business participants. Like in the business model, we have a series of 14 questions. Similarly, when you study the organizations, we ask questions like, are they going to operate a node, not operate a node? If they're operating a node between two organizations, do they need a secure channel, non-secure channel? So a lot of things. I'm going to move into, I do not know the time check. Let us see, I got 15 more minutes. So let us see. Design patterns. So one of the biggest things, Fabric gives you so many features that sometimes you could get lost, right? So one of the things is like, where do I store my data? This is a common question in every application that gets asked. And then like, how do I, how many chain codes? Should I have multiple chain codes on a single channel, or should I spread the chain codes into multiple channels? How many channels should I have between two nodes? You can do all kinds of things in Fabric, and you can get completely lost. A real complicated Fabric solution can be multiple nodes, multiple chain codes, multiple channels between the same two nodes. In fact, in one of the solutions, there were multiple channels inside the same node. It was like a closed loop, channel 1, channel 2, so that we could isolate out the ledger storage. There are cases that I've come across. So we have, and then how do we design and code the solution? And then we are faced now, as the network expands in Fabric, and a new participant wants to come, but they want to expand the network on their side, but not be part of this portion of the network. Because in Fabric, a channel is like a private blockchain. And you can have many private blockchains on the same network, and they won't all be isolated, but communicate as needed. And last but not the least, the business patterns. So let us see what we did in data design patterns. So when we started to analyze in many of the projects, we noticed that there is data that goes into a public ledger that every member of the network wants to see, transparent. There are channels in which there is privacy between two parties on the network. They are public, but they are only visible to those two parties. Then we have like private information. Okay, where do I store private information that is very specific to a particular organization? And then there is confidential information that needs to be encrypted. And finally, there is like off-chain information, like, for example, GDPR data cannot be on the blockchain. So, and there are also application-specific information that drives your blockchain solution. So how do we store? So we came up with a very simple way of looking at it. What we said is like, if I have 3 parties, right, organization 1, 2, 3, and all the data is public, then I need a single channel between all of them, reading from left to right. I have one collection, it's all the data is public, and so I have 3 organizations, org1, 3 peers, then I would put them all on a single channel. Now, if I have collection 2, where org1 and org2 share public data, and org3, org4, then I will have 2 channels between the organizations. So, I mean, this is kind of like a decomposition of a decision tree. If I have something that is, well, let us say, that is partially private, right? And then I have collections that are like confidential. That could be confidential data, purely confidential data that actually sits on the ledger. In that case, I have to use encryption. In Fabric, you can use techniques like sending transient, you can use transient data to go into the block, and you can send the keys in, and you can have your actual payload coming through another channel. So you can do all these things. If it is private, in Fabric, you can use site-db. So I can use all these multiple methods by which I can feed the data. If I use the keys on the payload itself, then it'll be visible on the ledger, so you don't want that. So how do I do that? And then, so finally, you have like site-db, because the data is private. Secure Keys uses it very effectively, and we have used it in some trade finance applications. I do not want to know how much I bid on it, but it is private to me, between me and my party, but I do not want to expose my quote. In trade finance, right, the supplier's invoice, the buyer's invoice is exposed by the supplier, and he gets bids from different financial institutions. If that data is very private, you don't want it on the ledger, the bid information, then you can utilize site-db, which is available in Fabric. So private data on site-db, and if the data is PII, personally identifiable information, then you put it off-chain, right? So that is like kind of how we do our data modeling a little bit. And the other thing is like channels. You can have many channels between 2 parties. There are many cases. I'm going to just use one example in this pattern. Like, let us say, high availability. So often it comes up, people don't want to pay for nodes. I do not know how many of you have actually costed how much your POC costs, right? A peer, if I were to use Fabric, and I know that well, an organization costs you $1,000, and then a peer costs you $1,000 per month. So technically speaking, if there are 2 organizations, $2,000 upfront cost, and then $2,000 per month. So there are organizations that do not want to invest in peers, but there are some organizations who want to invest. So if in the first pattern, I could have 2 peers that a particular organization hosts, org1, and org2 has only 1 node, but it trusts org2. So if there's a failure on any of the nodes, at least, I have activity still going on. But this still depends on how you model your endorsement policies and so on and so forth, right? So that way you can see high availability. Both organizations don't trust each other, so I have 2 peers on each side. Then the next model is like network with management peers. So there are 2 nodes which are organizational ledgers, and then there are 2 management peers that can store additional ledger information like audits and others that should not be visible to all the other organizations, but is visible only to the network. So you can do similar models. So there are like many things like single channel, then other things are like single channel, 1 chain code. Single channel, I can have chain code 1, 2, and 3. So I use this approach when we want to, in Fabric, the tendency is to write 1 massive chain code. But technically, when I worked with Ethereum, you could actually slice your functions into smaller bits, manageable smart contracts. You can do the same thing in Fabric. And so you can do C1, C2, C3 as multiple chain codes running on it. And the beauty is that each one of those smart contracts can talk to each other and update each other's ledger. If you want to separate them completely, then you can have multiple channels, and each one of, let us say there are 2 organizations, they use the same smart contract, but they want to isolate their ledgers out for other purposes, right? Like, then I could have multiple channels with the same chain code running on the same channel. I could also have multiple chain codes running on different channels. I'm going to skim through this, and then coding. I'm going to go here, and some of the patterns we used. If I use Ethereum, I can actually have all the addresses inside a registry, and I can figure out at runtime which smart contract is running where by the address, and I can actually communicate with contracts. I can build a registry. So we in some of the projects, we have multiple chain codes, so I need to have an effective way of managing them. So we do use a registry pattern in which, but unlike Ethereum, where I can model this inside as a smart contract, we model this outside on the Node.js client. We have a registry contract in which every chain code, what is running, what is its GitHub location is actually registered there. And I can actually use that model to do a runtime instantiation, because you can instantiate chain code from your client. So if I use the template pattern, I want chain code 1 and I want to reinstantiate chain code 1 again, I can look at the registry, get a copy of the code, instantiate it, and deploy it on any channel. So I can use registry patterns. I can use routing patterns. If I have a workflow on my application, and depending on the workflow, it has to call chain code 1, 2, 3, 4. We can use the routing pattern. I learned another thing in Ethereum is you actually isolate out data contracts from business contracts, simply because you want to actually preserve the data all the time. So if you do chain code, you can upgrade chain codes, but actually the data moves from chain code version 1.1 to 1.2. But what I learned while doing Ethereum projects is you can separate out data as a separate contract. It maintains all the data in the ledger, and business contract only does business functions. So you can isolate out data versus business. That way, changes in your business logic will not impact your data. Though changes in data structures can actually impact your data structures, but if you're storing everything in JSON structures, it doesn't really matter. You can continue using this. So there are some workflow patterns. We came up with dynamic instantiation. I said I can look at the registry and dynamically instantiate contracts. We wrote our own contracts for governance, which manages contract roles and permissions management. So as soon as a transaction comes from Node SDK, it hits the verifier contract, which verifies if that function is executable or not, and then only routes it to the appropriate contract that is supposed to run that function. You also used adapter because in supply chain especially, there is a lot of data that is common to many different contracts, but you have to translate them from one format to the other, so we've done some of that. Then I ran into some of the network configuration patterns, right? It's a very simple network. Everyone shows us the POC with 4 nodes and a single channel, right? But we have gone into complexities, because what happened is we started that way, and this is actually an actual example of a procurement application. And what happened is one of the ends of the node said, I want to now expand my own network. I'm a supplier, but I have affiliate suppliers. I do not want to make visible my affiliates to you. So they expand on the left, and each one of them could have their own node and have separate ledgers. Each affiliate could be on a separate node and have a separate channel so that they can isolate their ledgers, and so they can expand on one side. Or sometimes there are very small affiliates, they don't want to operate a node, so they come together and then they decide that I will use node C as a trusted anchor, and we all will trust it. And so affiliates could work with a single anchor node, or affiliates could have their own nodes. So a couple of different ways by which we have approached as our first app, because 2 of our applications have finished 24 months. We've been working on it for 24 months, since August of 2016. So as the network expands, we have to make sure that the network can scale and expand. So many of the other ones are like, how does it scale? And finally, how will it look like this? And each one can then keep expanding there. So you can see it's like a truly distributed network. And finally, in all the negotiations, we have a big problem. The customers want to know where the opportunity is. We wasted a tremendous amount of time, 3 months, and I'm going to let Isaac, because he deals with most of the customers all the time. So we said, let's come up with something that it makes life easy.
All right, so respecting your time, I know we're right at the edge here. I will just do tell you why we think the business patterns are important, and then I'll just give you a survey of them. These are all things that you guys have seen, read about. These are ones that we've happened to have the fortune of working on as well, and you've seen tremendous examples of many of these. Some have multiple patterns within them. I can think of Hyperledger, TradeLens, IBM Food Trust. I know all of those have multiple of these patterns, but everything from identity management and the work being done with Sovereign and Indy is great. Cross-border trade is huge. Digital asset registry, audit and compliance, financial settlement, system of record, data and document management, secured trade finance, disputes and reconciliation, provenance, asset track and trace. Again, nothing you haven't read about. We got a little bit more detail on each of these. The reason we have these and we think they're important is when we go in and to do that analysis, we're trying to make sure we're solving a problem that should be solved with blockchain. We're not just trying to throw blockchain as a hammer and trying to find a problem for it to solve. And that's one of the big things we go in with companies. And companies almost always start with I want to own it. You know, just typical enterprises, and we have to start talking to about consortium building and thinking about how to decentralize it in some way. And you can still have some traditional models of SaaS models and all, but you want to build the trust through some centralization mechanism. You want to solve data problems with solutions that solve data problems. And we want to make sure that we're positioning them so if they do leverage blockchain, that it's solving a problem today, and also positioning them for more features in the future so they can continue to take advantage of blockchain in other areas of their business. And that's one of the reasons we love Fabric, is that it is pluggable. And we do know that this is very nascent technology and it's going to continue to evolve, and that pluggable nature is going to make the investment that companies do today pay off more in the future than having to throw away everything and start over each time. So again, you guys have been great hanging out. We will take some questions, and I'm going to let Mohan take the questions since most of that information was his.
No, it's fine.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, so we've done several projects. I'm going to list out. We do track and trace. It's been 24 months. We've done procurement and contingent labor. That's 24 months in going from MVP. We've done 7 projects for the federal government, from logistics to secure votes and stuff like that. We've done compliance, where auditability of a manufacturer to a distributor to a end customer. There are so many other examples we can give. We have done trade finance. So,
just curious, can you provide some metrics on these projects, like how many participants are in this consortium, how many nodes they're running, like how many locations, etc.? So you can take the biggest one, for example.
Yes. So so our own network, so the solution we are having is 2 nodes right now, okay, which is going into production. So we have 3 companies that are signed up, but the thing is, like, before a node can operate, I have to finish the memorandum of understanding and other things, the legal obligations. So even though there are 5, I can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 members have signed up, the legal contracts before they can come on board is taking us time. So that would be our own trust your supplier. On the network, ultimately, we expect 15 nodes when all of them sign up, and we will have at least 20,000 suppliers overall to begin with. So by the end of 2019 or the first quarter of this, that many we expect them to sign up as passive users. They won't operate nodes. I told 2 of the networks I showed you where I'm saying scalability. They started off with 2 nodes, which means the procurement application, especially the client and their supplier, it started off 2. And now what happened is others have expressed interest. The supplier said, I want to expand the network to my this. So the supplier is negotiating with their suppliers. They go through the same process. So we know, that's how it is going to expand. So day 1, it starts centralized somewhat. And then as the network grows, that's when it gets truly decentralized. So this is the teething problem in getting production networks up and running. It's not like you cannot put I have a 5-node network. I can put 5 nodes, but that doesn't mean anything, Our own solution will have 2 management nodes, 1 for analytics and 1 for key management, and 1 will be the first anchor client, and then the second will be us as network managers and verifiers of the network, and then others will explain. Yeah.
As I was running down to your lecture, I was expecting something like Zaxman or Togav, and if you come together with such guys, SAP guys and so on, how do you communicate with them?
So when we communicate with SAP,
Please make your way to the third floor. Closing session will begin in 5 minutes.
yeah, so I'm a TOGAF certified architect, okay? So some of my thought process is always TOGAF. I need to know what the business does, and then how does it translate into different layers, right? So application, information, and this. But then we said the blockchain is not in TOGAF yet. And when we go to customers, that's when we saw those layers have to be understood. The workbook includes, like, when we do data analysis, we say, is this confidential? Is it proprietary to organization one, or is common? So we do the whole 9 yards of analysis. So that first few layers actually helps us to crystallize the solution.
All right.
But when we talk to SAP, we are negotiating, actually. I mean, like, your question was that. So we have to work with SAP and SAP architects, and we try to negotiate what the data is going to be, whether there's an Oracle that will be provided by them, or do we create the APIs, and will they just... Most often, we like to create APIs, REST APIs, so that they consume it, rather than having point-to-point integrations or message-based integrations.
All right. Well, we'll hang out here for a few minutes, give you cards. I know you want to run up to the final session.
If anybody wants,
Thank
I
you.
can give you my card. And